Hello, everybody. That's not going to do at all, do it? That's better. That's a lot better. Well, hello, everybody, to what is meant to be a bit of a ramble, but more of a debate, really, a debate question. I thought it was quite interesting because this recent subject came up in more than a few conversations I've had with a few people. It is something of a question that you cannot avoid, whether you are taking your car to a show or driving it about aimlessly or just on the driveway, fixing and tinkering. And that is my car a classic? It gets asked so many times on the Facebook groups. Is my Mark 1 Focus a classic? Well, it could be. The usual answer to that question is, if you think that your classic is a classic, then it is a classic. But really, if you leave it open to people's interpretations, it just gets stretched a bit. I mean, the last time I went to a show, the most controversial statement attached to any particular car, with that name tag of "this is a classic car," was a Renault Laguna on a 2006 plate, and that was in 2017. That is the problem when you allow people that interpretation. If you think it's a classic, it doesn't do, because people generally stretch that meaning, and it just demeans the whole idea of a classic car, doesn't it? The idea of a classic is that you can actually separate that car from the rest. A classic car is a niche, it is a rarity, and a car shouldn't be like that. A modern car isn't like that. It's far, it's mass produced, it's common, you can see them everywhere. That is the massive distinguishing factor between a car of interest and a car of non-interest, really, or very little interest, in terms of the car enthusiast community. Although I dare say there are people who are car enthusiasts who just enjoy modern cars. They hate old cars. They just can't stand them. They think that they should be in museums, the ones that exist, and that none of them should exist anymore, apart from a reminder of the past and why we should not go there, which I find is quite narrow-minded and quite sad, really. But it's their opinion, isn't it? And my opinion is very different. Now, you can listen to my opinion, but please put it in the comments what your opinion is, because this is very much a debate video, and I am just one voice, and you guys have a voice in the comments section. So be constructive with your answers, and let's just let us know what you actually think about what is a classic. The first denomination, or division I should say, is the vintage car era. Now, for me, the classifications are as such: vintage, okay, classic, modern classic, modern. Those are your four different types. Classic cars and vintage cars make up the majority of that. They just make up the majority at the moment. Vintage cars for me should be pre-war cars, pre-1945, okay? Or pretty much pre-1939, because we know not much was made in that 6 years. I mean, there could be the few odd manufacturers that continued, mainly utility buses during the war. They're called utility buses, mainly made out of very thin steel and wood in many cases. If you've ever been to a transport museum, you'll be unsurprised to see not one bus example probably in existence, because they were all made of very either cheap steel that they could, whatever manufacturers could get their hands on, bus manufacturers, coach builders as well, and wood. And for that reason, that combination doesn't tend to survive very well, especially over 80 odd years. So they were very minor examples. And in terms of cars, military vehicles, jeeps, that was all that was made. Everything was piled towards that era. So really pre-1939, and that is your vintage car era. Every car pre-1939 is of that ilk. They are very difficult to drive as cars. They are very different. I would not even think about owning one, even if I had the slightest bit of interest. They just don't interest me. They are appreciated and respected by myself and many people. I'm sure we've all been to a museum and thought, how did people cope? Even if that person who bought this car must have had a good job and quite a lot of money to buy this, my God, how do they live with it? And you realise that because that was the only thing available. Otherwise it was horse and cart. It's as simple as that, really. That one is fairly easy. The second one is not so easy. Classic. Now classic and modern classic, they get merged together a lot, and it's a bit of an issue where people probably interpret their car as a classic when it's actually a modern classic. And for me, there are two clear distinguishing factors between the two. Modern classics, we're going to go forwards here. Modern classics, they're quite reliable cars. They're very usable cars. They have ECUs. They have fuel injection with all the sensors to control, obviously, the ECU needs to control the fuel injection with all these sensors. They have all of the mod cons that you can expect, probably in a very basic manner in some of the earlier cars, or 90s, early noughties, and that's what we're looking at here. Catalytic converters. So we're talking about cars that were starting to be very much emission controlled in a massive, massive way. That does not mean, however, I'm going to say that every car, particularly in Europe, where we have the Euro 1, the Euro emission standard was introduced on the 1st of August 1992, if I've got my date correct. That does not mean that date is the cutoff. There was a bit of toing and froing around that date, but we are looking around that sort of time period. But some cars carried on for a long time. That means that doesn't mean, for instance, Minis continued production to 2000 before it changed to the new Mini. I'm not going to say that every Mini after 1992 is a modern classic. It's not. It's a classic. It's an absolute classic, even though ECUs, single point, multiple point injection, and all the gizmos to go with it to make sure that little A series was reliable enough and it could pass the emissions regulations. And that was what it was about, really. And the crash safety regulations, the amount of money they put into that car to keep that going. That's probably a very, very good example of a car that actually is a classic, despite it being after kind of the years where I think it kind of merged from classic to modern classic. And not forgetting safety legislation as well, like airbags, that kicked in. You know, a lot of people didn't like airbags when they came out. The steering wheels in the 90s, where airbags first came out, looked dreadful. They looked bulbous. It looked like an afterthought that somebody just blobbed onto the centre of the steering wheel, including the passenger dashboard, even though I would say that was a little bit more tidier generically. But then manufacturers got better at integrating them in and making them look like it's a part of the car. It's not an add-on that we've had to make. A classic, on the other hand, is not as reliable. Remember, I've spoken about this a few times about the peak generation of motoring, and that is your 90s to mid noughties, probably around 1995 to 2005, but give or take a few years on each side, please. Don't take that as gospel. That is peak motoring, a motoring generation of cars that were just so reliable, and so at the top of their game in terms of dynamics, performance, ride comfort, handling, everything in terms of ease of servicing. They were still relatively easy to service. I mean, we are talking about mostly everyday cars. We're not talking about Mercedes and BMW high-end stuff. We're not talking about that because they've always been difficult to service, mostly. And that peak generation of cars coincides with what I would consider them cars to be modern classics, because I really don't consider cars before then, with carburetors, distributors, Yes, there might be less to go wrong, but there was less control. And older cars from that generation, I would say, are far less reliable. They needed a bit of an encouragement to start on a cold morning. Some people have positive thoughts about that, but regardless, carburetors, distributors, points. This is classic car territory. These are devices that have been around since the dawn of the automobile, but it just evolved slightly to modernize slightly. But essentially, the working practices of all those things I've said are the same. And for me, if your car has a carburetor from the factory, I will tell you, a carburetor, a distributor, okay, you have a classic. That is entirely my line. You have a classic. If you have fuel injection, electronic ECU control fuel injection, I'd argue you would probably have a modern classic. But there are many fast Fords in particular that people are going to tell me, and fast Vauxhalls, that there are going to be so many cars that actually in the 80s had fuel injection, electronic fuel injection with some basic ECU control. The 80s was the start of things changing, but I still think on a massive scorecard, they are classics because they weren't particularly the most reliable things in the world. The engines were very much old school. Some were chain driven, some were single overhead cam. The way they go, the way they smell, these are things that make a classic what it is. If you start a classic, you will smell the oil and petrol, no matter how well you look after it. The tolerances on old engines are not brilliant, and Ruby is one of them. And the CVH is definitely in that category. It's an old school engine. It has all these smells and senses of an old car. A Zetec and a Sigma engine in this example that virtually replaced both the Kent engine eventually and the CVH. They are modern classic engines. A Ford Focus Mark 1 is a modern classic because it has all the characteristics and all the infrastructure that I would see in a modern classic. A classic is a bit more ancient than electronic fuel control, ECUs, and all the sensors and a catalytic converter, everything. They are far less refined, they are far less reliable, but that's what defines them for me. I haven't even talked about appearance, but actually I think appearances are very deceptive when it comes to classics. I mean, you look at a lot of 80s Porsche 944s, the 928. I know these are very luxurious cars that very few people bought, but come on, we've got a lot of cars here that are incredibly futuristic with the bodywork, and you could compare them with a 90s car like a Focus Mark 1 for instance, or any sort of bubbly late 90s car, early noughties car in fact, and think, you know what, this just doesn't look old, it doesn't look ancient. Yes, it does in certain corners, of course it is, but it doesn't. And for me, appearances are very deceptive, so I don't necessarily think that appearances should be taken into account. It's the actual infrastructure of what makes that car a functional, reliable car that you can start and drive and actually not worry too much about, I think my choke's not quite in. And a choke, by the way, is another sign of you've got a classic car. The differences between a modern classic and just a modern car, quite frankly, there's two demeanours really for me that make the difference at this moment in time. You have to have a very, very strong community within that particular brand of car, and a very enthusiastic community that want to see the car age and get better as it ages and be more appreciated. And that for me defines a car, its community surrounding it, how popular they are. In terms of technology, it's a bit difficult to distinguish a modern classic versus a modern car, even though I would say a modern car has far loads more sensors and far lots more equipment, and the seats are heavy, the doors are heavy, the amount of wiring that comes out of them in terms of wiring loom, How easy is it to change a headlight? How easy is it to do a basic service on them? I think these are kind of defining factors on a rolling scale of 0 to 10. 10's hard, near 0's easy. There is a very blurry effect. It's not black and white between what is a modern classic and what is a modern car. But age is obviously one of them. Like I've said, the community strength as well. But in terms of the amount of complexity, yeah, I think if you find it quite difficult to service them, that's too modern a car. If you have to fight to change a headlamp bulb or have to remove the entire headlight, yeah, I think that's definitely a sign that you've got a modern car. It's not a modern classic. All these factors have to add together. And for me, the Focus Mark 1 is a great example of a modern classic. The Rover 45 is a great modern classic like every other Rover. Every single Rover, 45, 75, 25, MG versions, they're all modern classics because they've all reached that age. They're all very popular. They all have a massive enthusiast community. And the Rover cars are all modern classics. Every single one of them. What about the Rover City Rover? Got to be careful what I say here. I think I won't say anything. So there you go. That's your differences, and that for me is what defines a modern classic with a classic. I've said it a few times before with Ruby. When I work on Ruby, there is nothing in my mind other than classic, classic, classic. It is a classic. Carburettor distributor, popular following or a growing following for these cars. There are many more factors. The smell of it, the way it goes, the way it vibrates, the way it just moves up and down in quite refined, but actually not a particularly fuel economy wise sort of engine really, although the CVHs back then were designed more for economy. There's a sense of you kind of scratching around the edges. It's not an economy sort of engine. Nothing was designed for it. A carburettor is just, you might as well just be chucking it in with a tap, you know. There's no, carburettors are not particularly refined. They're not injectors where they just squirt it in very gently. It's just throw it in, chuck it in and see what happens. It's completely hodgepodge in terms of how it operates, and you can feel that everything about it. The smell inside the car, arguably the smell of a car is actually not something that I would distinguish a modern classic from a classic, because eventually modern classics are going to become so old. Are they going to become classics? Is it because modern classics have not reached that age yet? Is there a cutoff? I mean, some people argue that the cutoff for classics is 1982. I heard that at a show, and the problem is the most difficult place to go is a show. It really does divide opinions, and people have got some extremely strong views about what defines a classic car and whether cars of all the cars that I own should ever be allowed in. And there was a particular show that had a cut-off date of 1996. I can understand why that sort of cut-off date might have been chosen, but that really does alienate people. I do think shows and organisers, there is a limited amount of space, and I can't comment on any particular show, but maybe just leaving the door open is probably a wise idea, because we don't want to divide communities. We want to kind of bring everyone together a little bit. Unfortunately, what you do tend to get in the door open policy of shows and local meets, whether it's at a pub car park or an actual field or an actual official show where you have to pay to go in. Well, I assume you go to one of these meets and buy some food, because that's how they operate, guys. Come on. So the idea is that if you leave the door open, you could have people in their 2015 plate Ford Fiesta Mark 7s. No, they shouldn't be in there. As much as that is, it's their choice to come, and I'm pretty sure that's the open door policy that the show owners have chosen to risk. But at the same time, people don't come to see a car they see on every street corner. They come to see cars like Ruby. Maybe a Rover 45, but most people don't seem to have good things to say about them. Maybe they've never owned one, most probably. And Focus Mark 1s. They want to see cars that are slowly disappearing or have disappeared, that they can remember. Nostalgia, things like that. But some people are going around thinking or saying we should have a cut-off date of 1982. Everything after 1982 was absolutely rubbish. I do not know how anyone can have a cut-off date for anything. It's all blurred. I think vintage cars, that's the only cut-off date I'm going to announce in this video. 1945, pre. That's it. Everything else is a bit blurred. Some people class vintage cars as pre-1955, pre-1960. I don't think so. I think or pre-1950 possibly might be that cut-off date. Again, it's open to interpretation there. And I'm pretty sure most of you are typing this right this very second. So I'm going to leave this open here. And I think also some people are probably given a false impression of where their car is. And as much as I really think that if it's your opinion that your car is a classic or modern classic, that it is. But the truth is, it's not your opinion. It's what people think of your car. It works both ways. It's a very complicated issue, and it does cause a little bit of division within the car community, especially the classic car community, because there are people that have grown up with their 60s, 70s, 80s, or maybe 60s, 70s classics. They're now ancient as far as I'm concerned. These cars are absolutely ancient now. Come on, they are 60, 50 years old now, these things. And 80s, 90s classics are booming because that is the era that is growing. And they are classics. And sorry, it is not shared. My opinion isn't shared if you think that the cut-off date somewhere rests in the 1980s for a classic and modern classic. I don't know how you can say a 1989 Fiesta Mark III is a modern classic. It just isn't. Maybe a late Mark III Fiesta, maybe, because the late ones, the Mark 3.5 had injection, single point injection, ECUs, catalytic converters, airbags, safety devices in little corners in there, a bit of structure to the body shell, the doors, door protrusion bars. You could argue a late Mark III is actually a modern classic rather than a classic. Quite interesting. I'm going to leave this here rather than a waffle of a big question. You take care, guys. Put in the comments what your opinion is, and I'll try and get round to them as much as possible. And I do say, if you have put a comment, and if you don't want to put a comment, look at people's comments and see whether you agree with them. It's a debate forum. Take care.